Thank you very much for this kind introduction. It's such a great pleasure for me to be here, to be allowed to address you, and a great thanks to the Crawford Fund to allow me to do so. Most things on Earth start with a seed, so let me also start with a seed. I would have very much liked to bring you a tiny little seed and show it to you. A seed of an undomesticated ancestor, a so-called wild relative of Lucerne. But the Australian biosecurity authorities would have taken an extremely dim view on an European turning up at an Australian airport with live plant material in his jacket pocket. And they are entirely right so. Which is, as it happens, the first thing I want to say to you. Seeds does move between countries, yes, constantly, in enormous quantities, to Australia's very considerable benefit, as I'll show you in a few minutes. It just doesn't move in pockets. It moves through a system. Permits and phytosanitary certificates, a treaty, a standard material transfer agreement that has been used hundreds of thousands of times, cold rooms, databases, and people who have spent entire careers making sure that a seed can travel from one country to another safely, legally, and on the record. That system is what I want to talk about for the next 20 minutes. And I guess that most people in the world have no idea it exists. Let me come back to Lucerne. That's what you call it in Australia, I learned. And by the way, that's how we call it in Germany too. Lucerne, not alfalfa. So at least on that one, you and I agree, and the Americans are on their own. Some years ago, scientists from SARDI, the South Australian Research and Development Institute, went out looking for wild relatives of Lucerne. This is not glamorous work. It is a vehicle, a GPS, a paper bag, and a lot of hours in stony country that most people would drive straight past. Wild plants are usually unspectacular. They yield badly. No breeder in their right mind would plant one in a paddock. But they had survived. For thousands, sometimes for millions of years in poor soils, on almost no water, they had done the one thing their domesticated cousins had slowly forgotten to do. They had endured. The SARDI team was part of an international effort to collect crop wild relatives before they disappeared in the wild, and much of that material was destined for gene banks. Now, here is a part I find remarkable. Nobody in that field knew exactly what those plants were for. There was no business case, there was no end user, there was no problem statement, no theory of change, no log frame. If you had walked up to those scientists and asked them, what is the return on investment here? The honest answer would have been, I don't know yet. Fast forward more than a decade, Kazakhstan. Drought that had become deeper and longer and more frequent on grassland, where livestock is not just a cornerstone of the economy, it is a culture, it is a dinner. Farmers there are now growing a new drought-tolerant Lucerne variety. It survives longer into the dry. It produces more feed. It keeps animals alive through seasons that would previously have broken the herd. And part of what made that variety possible was a diversity collected by scientists crawling around in the dirt years earlier for reasons they could not yet articulate. Imagine 4 places: a wild place where a seed was collected, a gene bank where it was safely conserved, a laboratory where its genetic traits were used to breed a new drought-tolerant variety, and finally, a pasture where a herd is grazing. 4 places that make the story of crop diversity. We are all being told the same thing at the moment in slightly different accents. The world is fragmented, aid budgets are tightening, attention is moving somewhere else, multilateralism is out of fashion. I don't need to argue with any of that. Most of you are living it. I would only point out one thing. Nothing in the climate system had taken note of the budget cycle. The drought does not read the aid statistics. The fungus does not check whether the project has been extended. Seawater moving into the taro patch in Kiribati is entirely uninterested in which department got restructured last quarter. The demands went up, the resources went down. It's easy as it is. So the question is no longer how to do more. The question is, what do we protect first, and how do we make sure it never has to be rescued again? I think gene bank is one of the worst words we have ever invented in my discipline. It sounds like a filing cabinet. It sounds like storage. It sounds like somewhere things go to sit. The comparison I keep coming back to is a library. Libraries and gene banks have a lot in common. They both offer opportunities. Opportunities that can be taken advantage of either now or in the future. The main thing is that the material collected, books here, seeds there, is kept safe in one place. And catalogs and indexes let us know where to find that. And what are the opportunities in a gene bank? What is actually on those shelves? Heat tolerance, drought tolerance, salt tolerance, resistance to a pest that has not yet crossed your border, a gene for iron or zinc in a staple eaten by people who cannot afford supplements. And here is the uncomfortable truth at the center of plant breeding, which I want to say plainly because it is not widely understood outside this room. You cannot invent a genetic trait that does not already exist. You can only find it, if not in nature, then usually in a gene bank, and move it. Gene editing doesn't get you out of this. Gene editing is a magnificent pair of scissors. It is not a fabric shop. Someone, somewhere, at some point, has to have kept the cloth, which means the raw material of every future harvest is already right now either in a cold room somewhere or gone. There is no third option. There is no version of this where we go back and collect it later. Now, Australia. Australia's 2 national gene banks, the Australian Grains Gene Bank and the Australian Pastures Gene Bank, together hold more than 284,000 unique seed samples, or accessions, as we like to say. That is a serious national asset. But the interesting question isn't how many, it's where they come from. Most of that material was requested and imported over decades from other countries through the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture and its multilateral system. Wheat that traces back to the Middle East, barley from North Africa, legumes from South Asia, forages from the Mediterranean. Australian farmers are right now harvesting the generosity of countries most of them will never visit. And it is happening as we speak. I want to give you one live example because it is a mirror image of the story I opened with about Kazakhstan. Australian chickpeas have a cold problem. If the temperature drops while they are flowering, pod-set stalls, the crop runs late into the heat and terminal drought, and the yield goes with it. That single vulnerability is a large part of why chickpeas sit in the warm north of Australia and struggle to move south and west. And you cannot breed your way out of it from inside the crop. The domesticated chickpea is genetically impoverished, a narrow sliver of what the species once was. Its wild relatives are not. On cold hillside in southeastern Anatolia grew wild sizer species carrying more than 100 times the genetic diversity of the crop itself. They germinate into a Turkish autumn. Cold is simply their normal. So GRDC, CSIRO, the Turkish Ministry of Agriculture, Turkish universities and UC Davis went out and collected them. Hundreds of accessions. And while they were out there, they found a sizer species that was new to science. And it works for Australia. At Mount Barker in Western Australia, wild sizer set pods in the cold at nearly 3 times the rate of domestic chickpea. And the wild by domestic crosses show that the tolerance can be moved across. So, hold the two stories up next to each other. A seed leaves South Australia and livestock survive a drought in Kazakhstan. A seed leaves Turkish hillside and an Australian farmer gets a crop that can be grown further south than it ever has been. Same story, arrows pointing in opposite direction. Which is the whole point. There is no version of this where one of us wins and somebody else loses. When it comes to food, we are not competitors who occasionally cooperate. We depend on one another forever. Collect, conserve, cooperate, and everybody eats. Don't, and everybody options quietly shrink. And Australia has given back. Those two gene banks have, for example, deposited more than 65,000 samples into the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, the ultimate food security backup facility in the Arctic. In depositing those samples deep in the permafrost there, Australia did not just contribute to safeguarding its own agriculture, but everyone's. So let me put this as directly as I can, because I think it changes the politics of the conversation. Australia is not a donor in this system. Australia is a shareholder in it. The Crawford Fund has a lovely word for this, the boomerang effect. You invest in agricultural research beyond your borders and the benefit comes back. New varieties, stronger biosecurity, better trade, better sciences. Crop diversity is the purest boomerang effect there. It has been coming back for 80 years now. Let me stay with the library for a moment, because that comparison goes further than shelves and catalogs. A public library is infrastructure, and so is a gene bank. Infrastructure has one peculiar quality. While it works, it is invisible. You probably thought about your coffee this morning, but surely you did not think about the electricity grid before you came here. You have never once been grateful for a water main. Nobody in this building, I'm pretty sure, has ever opened a newspaper to read the good news that the sewers worked again yesterday. Infrastructure is the category of thing we only notice at the moment it stops. Good infrastructure should, of course, be extended and improved, and gene banks are no exceptions. Better facilities, better information systems, but none of it comes first. What comes first in a gene bank is that the infrastructure is maintained permanently. What we call, in the least inspiring phrase our sector has ever produced next to the phrase gene bank, is essential operations. We call it essential operations of gene banks. Keeping the material at the right temperature, monitoring whether it's still alive, regenerating accessions before they are lost, characterizing them, documenting them, duplicating them somewhere safe, and above all, sending material out to anyone who asks for it, because a collection that nobody can use is neither a library nor a gene bank. It is a warehouse, nothing more. None of that is exciting. All of it has to happen every single year forever. Ladies and gentlemen, projects are wonderful. Projects deliver, but projects end and seeds don't. Seeds need care forever, and forever has never once appeared as an option in the funding round. And when this particular infrastructure fails, it does not fail loudly. A bridge closes and everybody finds out within an hour. A gene bank doesn't work like that. There is no alarm, no outage, no queue of angry commuters. There is simply a morning 20 or 30 years from now, when a breeder needs a trait and asks for the accession that carries it, and it's told it is no longer there. So let me tell you what it would cost to stop that from happening, to keep that infrastructure alive forever. Because we at the Crop Trust have costed it carefully, and the number is not what most people expect. To secure the essential operations of all the world's unique and valuable crop collection in perpetuity takes about 34 million US dollar a year. 34 million. For the crop diversity that underpins the food security of everyone in this room and everyone we will ever meet. Let me put that number somewhere you can see it. I will compare it with agricultural subsidies. I know that you are in Australia at the very lowest end of crop subsidies. This just delivers the OECD average. Across the 54 countries the OECD tracks, governments spend about $842 billion a year on agriculture subsidies. That works out at roughly $1.6 million a minute, which means the entire annual costs of conserving the world's most important crop collections, and on top of making these collections available for use, it was the world agriculture subsidies spent in about 21 minutes. So in the time I have been standing here, the world has spent on agriculture subsidy what it would take to run the global crop conservation system for an entire year. And what does the system return? Just one example of many. A single potato variety bred using material from the gene bank of the International Potato Center has been estimated to have delivered around $1 billion in value to farmers in Uganda alone. One variety, one country only. To secure the whole system permanently, the Crop Trust needs an endowment of about $850 million, not per year, once, about 1/1000th of what the world spends on agricultural support in a single year, and then never again. $850 million only. We are almost halfway there. Contributions are invested. The capital stays intact permanently. So we don't spend our money. We keep our assets and only takes the returns on investment. So a contribution by a donor made in 2026 is still working in 2070 and beyond, still paying for the cold room, still paying for the technician who has not yet been born. In an era of squeezed budget, the most radical thing you can do with the development dollar is to refuse to spend it. Permanent finance, permanent impact, and critically immune to the next budget cut, the next election, the next reorganization, the next crisis that pulls attention somewhere else. One last thing, a power station on its own is just a building. It becomes infrastructure the moment it is connected to somewhere. There are nearly 900 gene banks in the world. A unified global gene bank system is in its infancy, but it is growing. We are not short of collections, we are short of connections. So fund the gene banks, and you have nearly 900 gene banks. This is perfect, but fund the connection, and you have an entire system. The Pacific is not waiting for climate change. It is hosting it. Stronger cyclones, rainfall that no longer arrives when the calendar says it should, longer dry spells, new pests, new diseases arriving faster than the science can respond. And the crops under that pressure are taro, yam, breadfruit, banana, cassava, sweet potato. The Center for Pacific Crops and Trees, CPAC in Fiji, holds one of the most important collections of Pacific food crops anywhere in the world and makes that material available across the region. Australia has supported CPAC for years, and the Crop Trust is now proud to support CPAC's long-term food future through our endowment fund, made possible by a contribution from New Zealand. New Zealand money, a Fijian institution, Pacific crops, a global financing mechanism, Australian neighborhood, and a guarantee measured not in years, but in generations. That, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, is regional integration. A cold room in Suva that will still be running when everybody in this hall has retired. Let me come to a close. Australia is writing its first national food security strategy. COP31 is round the corner. I hope this will be an opportunity to change the way we view gene banks. First, change the category. Stop budgeting crop diversity as a project and start treating it the way you treat a port, a road, or a research station. It is not an activity, it's a foundation the activities stand on. At COP31, conservation of crop diversity belongs in the infrastructure paragraph, not the annex. Second, change the time horizon. When funders invest in breeding projects, they should channel at least a small portion of the funds, a legacy contribution, into long-term mechanisms. Not instead of projects, but alongside them, because a project buys you 5 years of results and an endowment buys you a century of capability. Colleagues, resilience is not built after the crisis, it is built years or even decades before it by people who will not be there to see that they were right. Almost everything that will keep us fat is invisible. Right up until the morning it isn't there. Every accession we conserve today is an option we are handling forward. Every partnership makes the next shock survivable. And the harvest that feed the world in 2060 are being decided now in rooms like this one. It is in our hands. Let's decide well. Thank you.